Because of his willingness to openly perform illegal abortions, abortion rights activists refer to Dr. Robert Spencer as the Angel of Ashland. They forget that for Mary Davies, he was the angel of death. This is Christina with the Sisyphean Journal, and today is December 9th.
Okay, today, December 9th, is the anniversary of the death of a young woman from New York named Mary Davies. She was 26, and she traveled from New York to Ashland, Pennsylvania to have an abortion done by Dr. Robert Spencer. Spencer was pretty openly doing abortions. He is kind of glorified by the pro-choice movement as the Angel of Ashland because of his willingness to do abortions. And he, by his own reports, let me see, Spencer was estimated to have performed between 40,000 and 100,000 abortions. But Mary is the only death that I can attribute to him, even though his quality of care seemed to have had a few shortcomings, resulting in Mary's death. But I'm not sure whether those shortcomings more relate to the time period rather than his practice. He actually seems, I'd put him kind of mid-level if he was an abortionist today. Not quacktastic, but certainly, not top tier. So he's not a Gosnell, and he's not a David Grimes or a Suzanne Popham. He's kind of in the middle. So at any rate, Spencer was known to be an abortionist, and Mary found out about him. Now, Spencer said that she reported she'd been bleeding for about 2 weeks, but that was probably because she died and he wanted to try to pretend that he hadn't been doing an abortion. Excuse me, because it makes no sense that he'd perform an abortion if she wasn't actually pregnant. He told her to come back the next day for an abortion, so she arrived at about 10 a.m. on December 9th, and he administered some drugs to administer anesthesia. He said, I injected the solution into the vein of the left arm, and in 10 seconds she was asleep. And he said the next thing he noticed was that she wasn't breathing and appeared blue. So he administered some drugs to try to revive her, administered oxygen and tried to revive her. He called his assistant into the room and had her work on Mary while he went and got some adrenaline. He tried injecting adrenaline. So they called the laboratory assistant over, and Spencer was putting in a breathing tube, but had to work blind because the light on his scope wasn't working. So he resumed artificial respiration, but eventually Mary died. Spencer said that he was puzzled, concluded that she died from some heart disease. Now, Spencer actually called the chief detective of Schuylkill County and said that he'd try to revive Mary with medications and CPR. When the detective asked why a young woman from New York was in his office, Spencer said, I'm well known in the East. I specialize in women's diseases. And he told the guy that women came to him from all over. So after 12 weeks of investigation, including sending Mary's organs to Dr. Milton, that looks like that's wrong. It's Milton Halpern, not Milton Hellman. Oh no, Dr. Milton Hellman of the New York Medical Board for a toxicology review. So the case eventually went to court, and there's Milton Halpern who testified. Dr. Milton Halpern was the chief medical examiner of New York, and he testified that Mary had been pregnant, that the pregnancy had been terminated right before her death, and that she died from the drug administered for the anesthesia. And a local pathologist also concluded that Mary had been pregnant and the fetus had been alive when Spencer begun the abortion, and that there was no medical or anatomical reason that Mary's health would have been endangered by the pregnancy. Now, Patricia Miller, author of The Worst of Times, which is this very hyperbole-laden about how somehow it was much worse to die from an illegal abortion than it is to die from a nice, safe, legal one, said that she had a doctor who had also practiced before legalization review the news reports. And this guy faulted Spencer for not having an assistant while he was administering general anesthesia. But that's something you see all the time in safe legal abortion deaths, or they've got an unqualified person assisting with anesthesia. Hanan Rotem had his receptionist. Joe Bills Reynolds had the guy he'd hired as a janitor administering general anesthesia. The guy with the unpronounceable name who did the fatal abortion on Laura Hope Smith had a handholder helping with general anesthesia. So, I don't think that that's any reflection on the fact that the abortion was illegal. After all, he had an assistant and a lab tech there. There was, the legality, the legal status of the abortion had nothing to do with whether or not he had anybody there assisting him. It just seemed to be his thing. And Spencer's widow said that he had actually been very stricken by her death. Right up until the trial, she said he continued to perform abortions along with his regular medical practice. He was acquitted probably because they couldn't really prove that Mary's pregnancy had been viable prior to the abortion, but it might have been just he was a highly respected doctor in the region, and people don't want their small town doctor going to jail. They want him there for them. Spencer's widow said that he briefly stopped doing abortions for a month or so after the trial, but resumed his business and eventually got entangled with a guy named Harry Mace, who had set up a business for himself rounding up abortion patients and bringing them to Spencer for a fee. And Spencer's widow lamented that Mace flooded him with patients and, pressured him to rush through abortions. Spencer's health started to fail. Mace's activities drew a lot of attention, so he got arrested again, but he died before the case went to trial. So, this really, Mary's death doesn't seem any different from a fairly typical legal abortion death. It's really hard to argue that abortion's legal status really had anything to do with what happened to her. And it'd be really interesting if I had been able to interview the jurors and find out why they acquitted him.